Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 34 of Podcast vs. Enemies, a Destiny massive breakdown show. My name is Impetus, and joining me as always are my co-hosts Court and Saint Kabir. We are starting our Grandmaster guides this week with a returning Nightfall, and throwing in a few weapon reviews to boot. But before we get into all of that, Saint Kabir is going to take this time to thank some special people.
We do not have any specific reviews or anything like that to shout out this week, so I just want to say thanks to everybody that supports the show and listens to the show every week via Patreon or wherever you may find our show. We really appreciate it. If you have feedback that you would like to give us about the show, positive, critical, constructive, feel free to leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. It's always appreciated and always helps other people who listen to podcasts find a show like ours. If you want to get a special shout out, just feel free to DM us or anything like that. Or honestly, just hit us up on Twitter or Discord. We are always happy to talk about the show, our topics, sections, anything like that. And again, we love to talk about Destiny. It's why we're here. So don't hesitate to reach out. All that said, what are we talking about this week, Court?
Yeah, we've got a classic episode for Podcast versus Enemies here. We do have the return of Grandmasters, so we're going to take a little bit of a brief refresher on the sort of 101s of Grandmasters. There's a little section here that I'll be covering later on about champions and just a sort of mini technical breakdown. Again, perhaps a refresher or some new information for some folks. We are, of course, going to be talking about the Glassway, which will be next week's featured Grandmaster, and, of course, the Nightfall weapons that were introduced this season. We don't have any housekeeping. I don't have a big 10-minute script related to a weapon, so no housekeeping or sort of updates. I think we're entering the realm of, the season honeymoon phase has certainly dwindled, and we're thick into the midst of season 18, which I think leads us perfectly into what we did in Destiny last week. I will start things off here. I did do the Master War Priest challenge. Big thanks to everyone that was involved there, but also Saint for stepping in. Really fun encounter. Been having fun with these master challenges. It does give me that Destiny 1 hard mode vibes, so I can't wait to do the next couple of weeks. I've also been ranking up some weapons: Battler, Amit, Doom, Hollow Denial, and Retrace Path, just to get them up. I'm really enjoying all of those weapons. Doom of Kelkus is just becoming one of my top favourite weapons. I know scout rifles aren't in they're not meta by all means, but they are, or at least Doom is a solid choice, especially with it being Void. Speaking of Void, I've been looking at some builds. I do want to take into GMs to test out their capability, specifically Arc Hunter. I don't have an Arc Hunter build to talk about this week, because I want to go in and actually test some builds. I am specifically looking at some blind builds, but Glassway will be the testing ground for some of those testing. But I do have some other elemental builds that I'll share this episode. Impetus, what have you been up to?
Not much, Court. I gotta be honest. Season fatigue has hit me pretty hard. I've also just moved, so I've got kind of that stress and all that additional stuff to worry about going on in the background. But yeah, I've kind of cut back on Destiny this past week. I did do my seasonal story. I did a normal Kingsfall raid run and a few Legendaries of Eternity runs. So the good news is I'm guaranteed to get my BXR Battler crafted next week, as well as the Doom of Kelkus. So I will be returning to D2 for those weapons in particular, and then also to test out my own Arc Warlock builds in GMs. We will have Nightfall coming the second week of GMs, and that does have an Arc Singe, so I'm going to do a lot of testing there to see what in the Arc Warlock kit is GM approved before we do our big guide, our big review of Arc 3.0. But beyond that, yeah, not a whole lot for me in Destiny. How about you, Saint?
Yeah, it's just been raids pretty much this week. Dipped a little bit in for the seasonal story, which it's been pretty. Some things are heating up there a little bit, which is nice. But honestly, other than that, I just did a Master War Priest challenge a couple times. Did one with the court and some of the Master Breakdowns guys, which is good. Honestly, I think this is something that brought a lot of stress, or people thought this is like a really tough challenge, but it's definitely one of those things where you can kind of, slowly hone in each potential passing scenario and that type of a thing. And I enjoyed that. And I think it's a good challenge. And I think it is something that you can master, outside of the bugs and things like that. There's a few times where we ran into the bug where somebody would take the brand and they both live, and then the Oculus just spawns and you fail the challenge, and that was weird. Luckily, we only hit that like twice in our attempts, so not too bad. The only other stuff I did this week was a bunch of the static triumphs for the Kingslayer seal. This is like the floor is lava for the Daughters challenge, which honestly, this is pretty fun. That one was basically you can't touch the floor if you're torn in Daughters, so everybody's always just jumping from pillar to pillar and things like that. Just kind of silly. The Golgoroth one is the conga line where every person has to stun him before anybody can stun him again, and that's just big time Destiny 1 vibes there. So that was a lot of fun, just going through all those random challenges. I still need to do like all Void and one or two others, but pretty, closing in on the Kingslayer seal, which I'm pretty happy about because that's just really badass. I mean, I'm just a sucker for the raid seals, just hooked on those all the way. And then other than that, I've just been spending a lot of time trying to get all the details nailed down for my wedding, which is in like 4 weeks. And there are a lot of details. It's very expensive, to get married, it turns out. And it's just been a reality the past few weeks, but exciting nevertheless. Now let's jump into some GMs. We'll kind of talk about GM 101. We'll talk about the strikes that are going to be featured this season, their general kind of modifiers that dictate your loadouts and things like that, as well as their potential drops. This is a supposed kind of drop list for this season. We'll follow up in housekeeping or something like that if the sequencing for some of these weapon drops or anything like that is going to change. We'll come back up on that. But generally speaking, October 4th, which is just a few days out, is going to be the start of GMs, and it's going to go until the 6th of December, which is the end of the season. You need to be 1595 to get into a GM this season. And here is kind of your general schedule rotation for them. We're going to start off with the Glassway. You can get DFA in that GM. You will have Barrier and Overload with some Arc and Solar Shields, as well as Void Burn. We'll be talking about that one in a little more detail today. Get a recap on that from episode 11. Then the next reset will have Light Blade, where you can get Mindbenders Ambition, Barrier and Unstoppable champions there with some Arc and Solar Shields again, and Arc Burn. After that is Fallen Saber, where you can get a Duty Bound auto rifle. That is Barrier and Unstop champions with Arc and Void shields and an Arc Burn. After that is the Disgraced, where you will get Militia's Birthright for the first time in its Adept version that will be available. There are Barrier and Unstop champs in the Disgraced. There are Arc and Solar shields there, as well as an Arc Burn. And then Exodus Crash with Horror's Least, which I'm sure some people will be anxious to get their hands on who didn't manage to get the role that they were looking for last season. That is going to be Barrier and Overload with Solar Shields and an Arc Burn for Exodus Crash. And then finally, we have the Devil's Lair. Silicone Neuroma will be the weapon dropping from here. Barrier and Overload champs, every shield type, and a Void Burn on the Devil's Lair. It will have a few repeat. Starting on the 15th of November, it will be Glassway, Lightblade, and Fallen Saber. Those first three will repeat back around. So that means there will be 2 chances to get an Adept Mindbender's Ambition, and only 1 chance to get 1 week, so to say, to get the Horror's Least or Malicious Birthright and Silicone Aroma. So make sure that you are around towards the end of October if you're going to be looking for an Adept version of one of those weapons. You can kind of get that on your calendar. We're not positive if any of the older weapons are going to be rotated out at the end of Season 18. That hasn't been officially announced, but the oldest weapons here would be Duty Bound and Silicone Aroma, so if they are going to rotate some weapons out, that is what you would expect. Luckily, I think that those have been around for a while, and then you'll have a couple of chances this season, so nothing crazy there. So we're going to go through breakdowns of every GM with kind of just abridged versions for those in this list that we have covered previously. Glassway updates for Lightblade or Fallen Saber to kind of talk about Arc 3.0 and meta and all that stuff and how the loadouts changed. But if there is a episode where we have previously covered this in great detail, we'll just recap the encounters, main points, kind of in a more abridged version and focus on the loadouts there. So if you're trying to head into a GM, we'll throw out a few just kind of general tips here for you, and then we will talk about champions and some details there about how to best deal with them. So off the bat, you really should be synergizing with your team. This is going to help you with shields and things like that in match game, and also how you're managing champions, but then also the exotics and classes you're running and stuff like that. We'll kind of get into how this impacts earlier, but you really need to be kind of communicating with your fire team here, who's bringing what super and champion stun and all that, so you can really be as efficient as possible, because if you want to be clearing GMs in under 30 minutes a piece, you're gonna be having to play pretty hard into the game's meta. It's possible to do every one of these with double primaries and nobody's running Aeons or Div or anything like that, but we're trying to help facilitate smooth GM runs, and sometimes that means capitalizing pretty hard on whatever the best stuff in the meta or the sandbox is, and all of the burns in our GMs, which, if we look back on that, there are no solar burns all season. It is strictly void and arc burn GMs this season, which is interesting. I'm not sure. I kind of wish that it was just like 2 of each or something like that, so that my loadouts weren't so completely static, but it does mean that some of these arc builds that we'll be talking about in the coming weeks are going to be particularly potent this season. So capitalizing on those burns and things like that, capitalizing on any buff that you can that is available in any strike is going to be really important. And then also, just try to study up in the encounters. If you just like charge into a room, guns blazing, you're going to die. There's really high odds you're going to die. GMs are a lot about playing very methodically, very strategically, kind of just clearing rooms, moving forward. Clearing rooms, moving forward is the whole mantra here. You're playing your cover. If you're going to be running these a lot, you're pretty much going to be memorizing your enemy spawns and things like that, what comes in with each boss and mini boss wave, which we'll recap on in like the Glassway and things like that. And then also you're gotta learn how to team shot, pretty much, and just focus targets to go through a row of champions or something like that whenever you're in a place that is gonna be very dense, knowing what to focus on first, maybe stunning a champion, focusing on a wyvern or a gladiator or something like that to make sure that your team stays alive. Capitalize on your burns, work with your teammates to synergize your loadouts, and team shot, focus down champs and things like that. Work your way through these GMs methodically, and that is what is going to lead to your greatest success, just in kind of general terms here. I'm going to pass it off to Court now, who is going to jump into champions and just all the different champs you'll face and kind of the best counters to each one of them.
Yeah, just before I do, this was my mistake for putting that in the script, but for Fallen Saber, it's Barrier and Overload, not Unstoppable. Didn't want to jump in there. Yes, champions. Now, there's been a lot of talk, I know, many grievances with at least with one specific type of champion, that's Overload. Champions are not well understood, so I thought I would take the liberty just to sort of take a 10-minute side just to technically break them down, because there is a lot of mechanics around barriers, unstoppables, and overloads. There's a lot of things going on in the background. I thought some people may not know about XYZ, so this is the section for you if you want either a refresher or just some valuable brand new information. So we'll start off with barriers here. They are comparably the easiest to deal with, and they are normally pretty passive compared to unstoppables and overloads. though some of them can feature long-range weaponry. I know, like Vex Hobgoblins, they have their ranged rifles that can snipe you down, which we will be talking about in this episode. There are Vex champions here in the Glassway. For actually defeating barriers, you can destroy barriers' orb shields, so that's the thing that they spawn around themselves, faster if you aim for the precision or weak spots of those champions. Perks like adaptive munitions and armor-piercing rounds do work against barrier champions, or their orb shields, I should say. And Disruption Break, which Arbalest has intrinsically, it does apply that 50% kinetic damage debuff, as well as... at least for Arbalest, it synergizes with its whole gimmick, with it being the ultimate barrier champion weapon. For how we're going to technically break down these champions, we'll cover the sort of the name and the duration for each stun. So the actual technical name for the stun, or the counter name for barrier champions to deal with them, it's called Shield Piercing. To apply Shield Piercing, all weapons and abilities that have or can perform Shield Piercing can do so intrinsically, with the exception of the Lament, which requires you to Sword Guard to actually apply the Shield Piercing blade for the follow-up swings. But every weapon, Ariana's Vow, Arbalest, this season we've got sniper rifles. You don't need to do anything, it's just part of the weapon. As long as you've got that mod slotted in, you just deal the damage, and you'll start to damage those orb shields. So what happens when you stun a barrier champion? They stun for 5 seconds. In Grandmasters, the duration scales by what difficulty you're in. So if you're in a master, it's slightly the stun duration is slightly longer. I think it's 5.5 or 6 seconds. For the actual cooldown, do barriers have cooldowns? Not technically, compared to Unstoppables and Overloads. No, they instead just have a shorter time when they remain unguarded before triggering their orb shield, which again is 5 seconds in Grandmasters. Shield Piercing does have other functions. So they do work against normal combatant shields, such as Hydra's rotational shield, which again we'll talk about this episode with the Glassway. You've got 2 different Hydras, so you can use Shield Piercing. Any weapon that has that, whether it's part of their intrinsic, like Ariana's or Arbalest, it is part of their build. You can shoot through those shields. Hobgoblins immunity, as well as phalanx shields. Any combatant that's got a shield, you can shoot through with these type of weapons. For Unstoppables, they can be scary because they do have that gigantic 70% damage reduction. So any weapon damage that you apply to Unstoppables while they're unstunned will have an immediate 70% damage reduction. That's massive. So you don't want to throw a Nova Bomb at a unstoppable champion that's not stunned, because it's not going to do any damage. Same with any, Thunder Crash. It's barely going to do any damage on Unstoppables. On top of that, they do have high aggression. So they like to chase Guardians. They like to chase you around various amount of places, rooms. So really, the big thing here is you don't want to panic. You want to deal with these champions at a large enough range and behind cover, if possible, to avoid being stomped or meleeed or blasted. When it comes to actually the counter or the stun name, Unstoppables are stunned by Stagger. The actual effect of unstoppable rounds is called Stagger. To apply Stagger from most artifact mods require a trigger to apply effects. So, for example, Unstoppable Hand Cannon requires you to aim down sights for a second to, quote, load an unstoppable round. Others like Bastion, Leviathan's Breath, or ability of artifact mods like Solar Melee have it intrinsically, so they don't need some sort of effect. So one shell from Bastion will sufficiently stagger an Unstoppable. You don't need to do the entire burst of Bastion. It can just be one of those shells. For other things, they do have separate functionality, like Devil's Ruin. You need that charged laser shot. Malfeasance, which is the exploding slugs. So you shoot 5 of those slugs, and they explode, and that's what causes the stagger. And Arthur's Embrace, which is the empowered weighted knife. Again, you need to empower that weighted knife to then apply the stagger when you throw the weighted knife. Stun duration, again, is 5 seconds in Grandmasters. There is a cooldown. So once a unstoppable champion is unstunned, they will be unstunned for 5 seconds, and they cannot be stunned within that 5-second cooldown. So visually, you can see this, whether they're stunnable or not. All the unstoppable champions have these sort of antler-like energy entrails on their backs and their shoulders. They will pulsate in white, meaning you cannot stun them. Once they return to the original reddish color is when you can properly stun them again. Stagger does have some other effects against other combatants. You can use it on unshielded combatants, which will cause them to stagger back, a bit like explosive rounds. It does impede their attacks and their ability usage. Specifically for this week, again, very relatable for this week, Wyverns. Stagger rounds can open up Wyvern's chest to expose their precision hitbox. So you don't need to whittle them down to about halfway damage to open up that chest box. You could just use a unstoppable round to do that. Obviously, in the Glassway, we've got barriers and overloads, so if you want to go down that route, it may be a little bit risky because you're bringing in a champion mod, which effectively doesn't have much utility other than staggering other combatants and here, but you could go down that route. Finally, overloads, which is perhaps the most frustrating to deal with due to their spamming abilities and supercharged health regen, but also the most misunderstood of the 3 champions, just with the general confusion around disruption rounds. So yeah, the stun or the counter name is disruption. To apply disruption, again, like stagger rounds, there is sometimes a little bit of a trigger to apply its effects. Overload SMG, we see that quite a lot. Requires you to perform sustained damage for about a second, which will then apply disruption rounds. It's not intrinsic. You don't just apply it as soon as you start shooting. You need to shoot for a second, and then it'll apply disruption. Other things like Divinity, Thunderlord this season, getting a big glow up, and other ability artifact mods like Void Grade Melee apply it intrinsically. So Divinity and Thunderlord, you just have to shoot at them and it causes that disruption effect. And separately, or for other separate functionality, Le Monarch, which requires the poison arrows, that's the perfect draw, or Secant Filaments, which requires you to stand in an Empowering Rift, which applies Overload Shot to any weapon that doesn't already have a champion counter active. Again, for the stun duration, it's 5 seconds, and for the stun cooldown, it's another 5 seconds. Visually, you can see this just like Unstoppable Champions. The visual indicator is instead these energy entrails around the chest of the champion. And again, they'll pulsate in white, meaning you cannot stun them. And once they return to their original reddish color, it's when you can stun them again. So this next subsection here is this is really the biggest highlight, and probably the reason why I script wrote this entire section is 3 different things with disruption. The one that I think most people don't entirely know about is that you can apply disruption to any combatant, and that is including other champions, mini-bosses, bosses, rank and file, anything. The effect will cause them to perform 25% reduced damage for 5 seconds, and that can be refreshed. So you can apply this to, we'll get onto talking about the boss for the Glassway later on, but you can apply this to the boss and it will do 25% reduced damage. The other 2 big distinctions here to note is the 2 separate effects that belong to the disruption effect, and that is the stun capability and the disruption effect. The former, the stun capability, is what actually causes the stun, but it's the disruption effect, which is what I think a lot of people are a little bit confused around. It's not well explained in the game. I think we can all appreciate that it's something that could be improved, but for actually understanding how this works is that it impedes the Overlord's champion's health regen and ability spam. You can apply the actual disruption effect any time, regardless if the Overlord champion cannot be stunned. As long as you're consistently applying this, you will stop that supercharged ability spam, teleportation, and the health regen. So that's your two big distinctions there, that yes, you can stun champions, but you can keep applying that disruption effect to stop those health regen. Just finally, before we actually get on to breaking down our builds, just some really quick highlights here is that champions are classified as mini-bosses. So they are affected by Vorpal Weapon. So that's 20% for primaries, 15% for special, and 10% for heavies. They're affected by major spec. That's 7.77%. They can be slowed and frozen. They can also be finished. And although they cannot be directly suppressed, as the suppression effect doesn't do anything to them, any suppression triggers and synergies like Echo of Domineering, Stylish Executioner, Repulsive Brace, and Collective Obligations Suppression Siphon can work on them. Speaking of the frozen effect, again, it's another big topic that many are maybe not fully, they aren't fully aware of what's going on here. Using stasis against champions does require a lot of care and expertise as to when you should and shouldn't use them. Generally speaking, you should just avoid using stasis freeze against champions if you're not comfortable in doing so. Why? The big reason, because freeze will reset champion cooldowns and effects. So the barrier's orb shield spawn, that duration of 5 seconds will reset. As soon as that champion is thawed out, they will immediately pop their orb shield. Unstoppable's damage reduction modifier, that's a big one. If you freeze an Unstoppable while it's stunned, it'll reset that reduction modifier. So I think this is one thing that maybe some people were realizing quite a lot with the Totems challenge from last week, is if you were freezing those champions, you won't be able to do any damage to them, and then you have that cooldown which has been reset back to 5 seconds. You can't effectively stun them again. So it's really important not to do that for Unstoppables, especially with that damage reduction modifier. And for Overloads, it also reactivates their supercharged ability spam and health regen. Stasis can also sometimes cause Overload champions to temporarily be unable to take any disruption effects after being frozen, meaning they will potentially continue to regenerate health regardless if you've already applied the disruption effect. So when can you use stasis? If you're in a pinch, then freezing a champion in place is a viable strategy. Only as a defensive means to either relocate somewhere else or to reconvene with the rest of your fire team. High-level players can use stasis to circumvent and even brute force champions, but this is highly dangerous, and for GMs, it's maybe not at all viable. For other lower-end content, yes, you could, you can. I know in lesser difficulties, you can effectively forgo using barrier champion mods and just use a chill clip fusion rifle. And that will do wonders against those champions. But for Grandmasters, it's not I don't think that's a viable strategy. Although, it may eat my words, because one of my builds that I'm going to talk about does revolve around stasis. So yeah, that was a little bit of a mini technical breakdown of everything. All this information and the data is over on my spreadsheet. There is a Champions Guide tab on my spreadsheet. This is updated every season to show what champion mods and exotics are available at your disposal. So yeah, if you've got any questions, please let me know as well. I have spent a lot of time, going up against champions and just figuring out how they function, the sort of mechanics around their AI system. It's very interesting, and it's very misunderstood for the around the Destiny community. All right, enough for me. What are we going to talk about with the breakdown for the Glassway there, Impetus?
Yeah, so I'm going to give us a brief activity overview. We'll talk about what weapons we can be thinking about bringing in, and then we'll get into our class and ability toolkits in just a moment here. So we have Barrier and Overload champions. The mods available for those respective champions this season. For Barrier, that is going to be Auto Rifle, Scout Rifle, and Sniper Rifle are your options there. And then for Overload, we have Bow, Machine Gun, and Arc Grenades. These shields, we have Arc and Solar, and we have a Void Acute Burn. That means 25% outgoing damage has been increased, and your incoming damage has been increased by 50%. So we'll get into what that means in a little bit when we talk about our abilities, but what you need to know from the weapon point of view is you got to cover the shields first and foremost, but if you have space in your loadout, Void weapons, especially Void heavy weapons, are going to be really strong here for just getting an extra 25% damage that is going to be active on every enemy throughout the entirety of the GM. So definitely spec into the burn when you can. We have a few additional activity modifiers. Arachno, that is mines when you defeat Vandals, will spawn in. Watch out for those. You do, of course, have the typical GM list here of Match Game, Extinguish, Mob, which is extra champions. Some noteworthy, the special enemies, Wyverns, are definitely going to be a big threat here. Fear them is what we have written in the script. They can be a big problem when they show up. Thankfully, they are only present in the boss room. But, well, I guess that's not thankfully, because that's the last place you want them to show up. But they're in the boss room, basically. Obviously, the Overload Captains and Minotaurs. So we have Fallen and Vex enemies in this GM. So we'll get two different types for each of our two champion types. So it's Captains and Minotaurs for Overload, and then Hobgoblins and Servitors for the Barrier champions. Let's move into our recommended weapons here. I'll start with our primaries. On the exotic front, I'm going to recommend Le Monarch. That is our exotic Void Bow. You can pair that with the Overload bow mod for some very easy overloading damage, plus, of course, void damage as well. Do remember that the stun from Le Monarch is going to come from that perfect draw and the tick damage, but that is an excellent way to keep, the tick damage in particular is an excellent way to keep that health regeneration and teleportation and ability spamming at bay on overloads, especially when you have more than one overload that happen to be right near each other, as is the case in the boss room. The other one I'm going to throw in here, Hardlight, that does have intrinsic anti-barrier and shield coverage. Again, the anti-barrier coming from the mod. Shield coverage is also going to be very helpful for Arc and Solar, and then when you don't have shields present, you can swap to Void for that extra damage, so that's going to be useful. Wishender does have the intrinsic anti-barrier. The big thing with these three primary exotics is that if you need to run ammo finders, these weapons will give you the highest chance of spawning that heavy ammo because they are exotic primary weapons. So that's just a feature of the mod. That's not something that's intrinsic to the weapons, but that's how ammo finders have been reworked recently. So something to bear in mind there. If you do have space for these in your loadout, you'll get that extra coverage if you want to run an ammo finder mod. On the legendary primary front, Scouts for Barrier and then Bows for Overloads are going to be our kind of recommendations for what primaries to bring in here. So starting on the Scout front, Doom of Calcus, that is a Void Scout taking advantage of our Acute Burn. Tarnished Metal is going to be Arc. We just talked about that a few episodes ago. Staccato 46 is our Solar Scout, and then you also have Vision of Confluence, which has an Adept version. That's another Solar Scout. You can do Rewind Rounds and Disruption Break for champions. It's going to be very helpful there. On the bow side, Strident Whistle is our Solar one of recommendation. That drops from Vanguard Strike playlist. Arsenic Bite is I believe that's just dropping from Banshee right now, so that's pretty rare, but it does have a sweet perk combo of Rampage and Explosive Head. That can be very useful, or even Dragonfly Explosive Head. That could be very, very helpful for dealing with champions. Wolf Tone Draw, a bit more recent arc bow, and then Under Your Skin is the Void Bow from Season of the Risen that is craftable. Very, very strong. I think we recommended Archer's Tempo and Explosive Head on that one. Very, very, very potent bow. Moving on to our special exotics. We've got a lot of anti-barrier champions this season, so I think you know where we're going with this. But yes, Arbalest is going to be a fantastic option for every single GM this season. We're going to be talking about it all the time. We don't like talking about it. It's kind of just the go-to, but if this is your first time doing the Glassway, I can't recommend this weapon enough. It is very strong. You can pop all of the anti-barriers in one blast. You can pop shields in one blast. Very helpful, and it's in the kinetic slot, so it does free up your energy slot for a primary to cover other things if you'd like. We have Anti-Barrier Sniper this season, so that does open us up to some fun options. Izanagi's Burden is going to be the hardest hitting anti-barrier weapon available. Very, very strong, especially if you get that ×4 honed edge. You can definitely consider that if you need to blast through some wyverns quickly, or some overload or barrier champions after they've been stunned. Very, very powerful. Divinity has intrinsic overload and that debuff that it applies. This is probably going to be my other recommendation for someone going into this GM for the first time. Very, very convenient, very consistent overload is going to be very helpful, especially in the boss room. Just making sure that those overload champions do not overwhelm you when you don't have a lot of space to rotate around. So definitely consider Divinity on your team if you are going in for the first time and you'd like to have the strongest loadout possible. I think that with a few Arbalists is going to be a very, very strong exotic pairing. Witherhoard can also be excellent. I will talk about Witherhoard a little bit more when we get to our Warlock breakdown, but excellent crowd control and then very useful for doing damage over time to champions, bosses, and the mini-boss, of course. On the legendary special side, blinding grenade launchers can be very helpful here. Just make sure you don't blind yourself accidentally. Legendary snipers, we've got a lot of really good options if you want to lean into that. Defiance of Yasmin, just talked about that one. Father's Sins, Fugue 55, Frozen Orbit, Adored, Uzume, very, very strong options. If you have really good rolls for those can be very useful against champions for that very quick burst damage. And then, of course, Chill Clip Fusions, there are only 2 of them. Very strong. Riptide's probably the best one that dropped from Crucible last season. Very helpful for, again, slowing enemies that are coming down. It will take multiple blasts to fully freeze an enemy, so if you're trying to avoid a freeze, you can do that, but you can just go for a straight slow if you'd like on an overload champion to prevent it from walloping you, or a wyvern, for example. So definitely consider that if you'd like. Moving on to our heavies. In the exotic slot, Deathbringer and Two-Tailed Fox are going to be very helpful for taking advantage of the Void Singe. That can do a lot of burst damage. Just make sure you're not firing it at enemies that are close to you, of course, as those are rocket launchers. Two-Tailed Fox will also help with those solar shields if there are any that you're firing at. Anarchy is another one that I'm going to recommend. I will talk about that a little bit more when we get to Warlocks. That can be very useful for blocking off doorways and hallways, just getting some crowd control, area denial, just like Witherhoard, but a little bit stronger as it is a heavy weapon. On the legendary front, Linears are going to be a pretty strong, safe option for burst damage. So Taipan and Threaded Needle are your void options here. Again, we really want to make sure that our heavy weapons are lining up with the acute burn so we can have as much extra damage as possible. So those are our 2 recommendations there. If you want to run a machine gun for overload, you're welcome to do that. Corrective Measure, Commemoration are the 2 best options there. Very good for damage over time, not so much in the burst. So you'd probably want to make sure you pair that with a harder hitting kinetic weapon like Izanagi's Burden, for example, to make sure you get that burst damage coverage when you need it. And then on the rocket front, again, you could run that depending on your playstyle. I think that's probably a bit more of a skilled player's option, but Red Herring and Tomorrow's Answer both have some very strong roles there on the Void rocket front. So those are your weapon recommendations. I'm going to move on to some of our artifact mods, just some things to bring to your attention before we dive into our subclass breakdowns here. So for this season's artifact, we do have Overload Arc Grenade. Again, it's a Void Singe for this particular GM, so maybe not going to be too much of a play here, but that could depend on your class on what you want to run. Speaking of arc mods, though, we do have kind of a 3-piece recommendation here. These 3 are all going to go on your class item. They will use your class item entirely. That's a 10 out of 10 energy, so you won't be able to put anything else on your class item if you're running these 3, but you do get a pretty sweet setup. So that's going to be Surge Detonators, Lightning Strikes Twice, and Bad Amplitude. That is definitely geared towards endgame for dealing with champions, and then empowering, well, that's not the right word to use because that does mean something in the game, but making sure that your arc abilities are as strong as they possibly can be. Again, if you are on an arc subclass, You don't have a lot of healing capabilities, but you are kind of really speccing into damage. So for our more skilled listeners, I would definitely bring this to your attention if you do want to run Arc for any of our GMs. But again, for this one in particular, we're probably going to push you more towards Void subclasses. So speaking of which, I'm going to pass you back to Court to talk about his Hunter recommendations.
Yes, just before I do, who put Deathbringer? Because someone's trying
I assume
to.
that was you, sir.
No, it wasn't.
No, that was me. That was me. You don't like Deathbringer?
Oh, Saint, you're winning my heart, man.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah, well,
it's one of my favorite heavies.
Yeah, and you can't kill yourself with it, which is great.
Yes, no self damage,
no proof. Yeah.
It's what Xenophage is to you, Deathbringer is to me.
Wow, that's saying something.
Yes. Speaking of Deathbringer, yes, lots of voids. I have 2 void subclasses here that I want to, or builds, I should say, that I want to recommend, and also a stasis one that I alluded to earlier. Very quickly for the 2 voids, because one of which is still currently being built, that I haven't posted yet. It's related to suppression. Suppression isn't it's quite a rare void effect to apply, because not a lot of things actually apply suppression. But if you want to go down that route, you can absolutely, with the Void Hunter, Deadfall, Gambler's Dodge, Omnioculus, Wave Splitter, and Suppression Grenade. You can go for Trapper's Ambush, Vanishing Step, with echoes of Domineering, Provision, and either Dilation or anything else that you want to use. Harmonic, Siphon, Impact Induction, and Well of Tenacity for your mods. Very brief there. I will be posting this later, whether that's this week or the following week, for the builds and theory crafting forum over on the Massive Breakdowns Discord server. You can just search for my name within the forum, and it'll be under the Void Hunter mega thread. For an actual Void Hunter builds that I want to just talk about specifically, it's related to Aeons. So again, same setup as the previous build there, Deadfall and Gambler's Dodge. 8 for the exotic Aeons, for the actual exotic weapon that you want to bring in. Ideally, you want to go for a champion counter one. You don't have to, but it's there. I'm not going to specifically recommend a weapon because it's not really part of this build's. It's not part of the build's identity. For the grenades, Vortex is always a solid choice for Void. For aspects, we've got Trapper's Ambush and Vanishing Step. And for the echoes, we've got Undermining, which is that Void grenades now do a 15% debuff, but you do get that minus 20 discipline. Echo of Obscurity, which is that on Finisher, you get you're shrouded in Invis, and you do get that plus 10 recovery. And Provision, which is the minus 10 strength, and that provides, it's the one that's now escaping me. Let me just pull up.
You get melee energy when you damage with grenades.
That's the one, thank you. And so you can sort of see from the sort of overview here what we're going for. Aeons is all about finishing with the Sect of Insight mod. Obscurity will tap into that. So there's a lot of synergy when it comes to finishing combatants. For the specific mods here, Harmonic Siphon, Momentum Transfer, that is the one that provides melee energy for grenade damage with that 7-second cooldown. For this specific build, again, it's partially finished, and hopefully this will be the one that will be going up first before the other suppression build one. I'm going for Well of Striking and 3 mods of Well of Striking plus Bountiful Wells, plus giving you that Overcharge Wellmaker. Overcharge Wellmaker, again, because you're finishing combatants, it's going to spawn those 2 Arc Wells. Well of Striking, if you pick up an Arc Well, it gives you melee energy. And obviously Bountiful Wells just increases the amount of Arc Elemental Wells that spawn from 2 to 3 with Overcharge Wellmaker. The base effect for Overcharge Wellmaker is 2. It's not 1. So yeah, the whole gimmick of this is to sort of embracing the Night Stalker auxiliary role. You'll be applying Trapper's Ambush just as many times as you'll be finishing any combatant. So this builds into a sort of pseudo-Omnioculus build, where you'll be getting your melee returns back. Not as much as Omnioculus, but if you're playing into the core of this build, then you'll have Trapper's Ambush up all the time. So the stat spread here is 100 resilience ideally. Focus on mobility next, and then strength and discipline. So the gameplay loop here, upon finishing a combatant, 3 arc wells drop. That's 2 from Overcharge and 1 from Bountiful. Picking up one of these provides a 17% melee return, or 51% on all 3 if you pick them up. There's no cooldown on this melee return gain, so just go nuts finishing combatants. And just as a slight bump, you can get 20% on grenade damage for momentum transfer, just to give that, again, an additional melee bump. That does have a cooldown of 7 seconds. So some of you may be thinking, why aren't you using heavy-handed? And this was something I quickly tested before we went in and started to record this episode. It does work with Trapper's Ambush. There seems to be a very noticeable delay between when you do Trapper's Ambush and then it giving you that 50% back. You can go for that. You can go for heavy-handed. It is a very expensive mod, and it's 7 energy. It's arc affinity. It's not always going to be possible to slot into your builds. You do need to spec into using it with elemental charge. So you could go down that route. I'm still like 50-50 between using Well of Strikings versus heavy-handed. I suppose with the whole gimmick with Overcharge Wellmaker and Well of Strikings is you're synergizing it with Aeons and with Obscurity. So 50-50 here. This may change by the time I actually put this build up on the Discord server. I alluded to the Stasis subclass. Again, this is something that I've talked about before, so I won't go into too much detail. It is the Revenant Gambler's Dodge for the super and class ability. Renewal Grasps and potentially Agar Scepter if you want to bring that in. If you don't have Renewal Grasp, you could go down the Frosties route as well. And with the actual grenade, you want to go for Dustfield, and for the aspects, Touch of Winter and Grim Harvest. You've got a lot of fragments here. Just with the nature of Stasis Hunter, you can get up to 5, which I have chosen for the Stasis subclass here is Whispers of Hedrons with that -10 strength. Hedrons does give you that plus 60 to mobility, resilience, and recovery, as long as you're freezing combatants. Chains, which gives you that plus 10 recovery, and it does give you that damage resistance. Shards, which is that plus 10 resilience. Conduction, which is plus 10 intellect and resilience, and Rhyme. Rhyme is quite I don't tend to see it a lot used in any subclass, whether that's Titan, Warlock, or Hunter. Rhyme is one of those fragments which is very useful because you do get that stasis overshield, which you can only get on while using Whisper of Rhyme. And so the whole gimmick with this whole subclass is you're going to be spawning a bunch of shards, and you can pick those shards up to give you a bunch of energy, whether that's related to your it's related to gaining melee energy, or it's related to getting your overshield or health bump, which is what Whisper of Rhyme provides as well. Again, this is quite an advanced build, and it's very specific as to what you need slotted and where, along with the gameplay loop. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. I did write a big script here of like the main loop, but this is all on the Massive Breakdowns Discord server under the Theory Crafting forum. All of this is within the Stasis mega thread, but just a general, very quick overview. The whole point is you're going to be freezing a lot of enemies. And I think with this particular strike, with the Glassway, a lot of enemies are going to be funneling down one path or another. So if you pop your Dustfield grenade or your super, you just capitalize on gaining all those shards back to bump up your melee energy using the specific mods, which will be listed under the mega thread. You just keep perpetually feeding yourself, providing dust field just to slow the enemies, because this is definitely one of those strikes which requires you to just really slow down, and this makes the best out of the circumstances. And it's one of the builds that I plan to take in on one of my first runs, just to see how it really performs. I've got a good idea this is going to be a really good build to take into the Glassway. But like I said, all that's under the Massive Breakdowns Discord server. If you want to get into the main gameplay loop, there's a lot of script and text that you can see how each thing loops into the next, and then it just loops back into itself. All right, I'm going to pass you over to Saint with some Titan recommendations.
For the Titans here, I am going to talk about two versions of a Void build for this one. We'll get into Arc builds probably in our next GM breakdown whenever we have the actual Arc burn come up, but basically the two branches of this Void Titan build are, is someone with you running Divinity or not? Because one of them is like super focused on having debuff grenades, avoid weakening up all the time, which is very useful. It's even more useful if you don't have a teammate that is also can apply a stronger debuff, a 30% via Divinity all the time. So it just depends on your team build here a little bit. And then the other version of this build is going to be just a little bit more offensive and kind of focusing on the volatile abilities and stuff like that. So first version of the build, actually I should say both trees of this here are using Banner Shield. I just prefer this to a bubble in this strike. Everything gets just cranked up to 11 in the boss room, and the way that Banner Shield allows you to just be a little bit more active here, and as well as the plate defense section, I think is just a little bit better than your general bubble kind of access, and the way that will play into needing to dip in and out of the bubble and things like that. For the really grenade heavy build, we're going to be using Heart of Inmost Light, Vortex Grenades, and then Bastion and Offensive Bulwark for our aspects. This is very important because you're casting your barricade, and as soon as you get that overshield up, you're getting that. Not only are you getting the buffs that are kicking in from Heart of Inmost Light, but you're also getting the increased melee and grenade cooldown from Offensive Bulwark, and your grenade cooldown is obscenely low. It is very fast compared to what it would be at base with either of these things to play, let alone both of them happening at the same time. It's very strong. For our fragments, I'm going to be using Undermining and Remnants, which is the weakens, or Void Grenades weaken, and then Void Grenades last longer. And then finally, I'm going to be using Starvation for Devour whenever I pick up an orb. This kind of leans into a little bit of survivability here for this build. And then on the mod side, I'm going Elemental Armaments and Ordnance, so weapon kills and grenade kills, and then Font of Might, Seeking Wells, and Bountiful Wells. So Bountiful Wells is just more wells, and this kind of whole loop just plays into getting a lot of void kills and things like that, and then leaning into my grenades. I'm playing really barricade heavy. I'm probably using, Secession and Lemon Arc, or, Honed Edge is Isonic's Burden with something like Under Your Skin. So playing a lot of range here, playing on that barricade very heavily, which is why Seeking Wells is also nice, because I'm going to be kind of just dipping in to pick up wells and then going back out. Whenever we look to a bit more of an offensive build with a focus on detonation via volatile, I'm going to be switching out my Heart of Inmost Light for Ursa Furiosa Gauntlets, and that is going to just generate more orbs for my teammates. This is also something that can basically be more or less valuable depending on what your teammates are running and kind of what your class setup is there. And then I am going to swap out my Offensive Bulwark for Controlled Demo. So now I've got Bastion and Controlled Demo, and then I am swapping out my third fragment from Starvation for Devour to Instability for volatile rounds on grenade kills. So this is a little bit more offensive here, a little less about the debuffing, a little bit more about getting those volatile explosions to just pop off continually, and that is definitely pretty deadly, especially if you're running this with something like Lemon Arc and you have you're getting weapon buffs, you're getting Font of Might up, you have volatile rounds going that is going to be super strong on your like Void primary bows or Tomb of Chelsis or anything like that, whatever you're using. So really leans in full on Void here, but both of those kind of trees using Ursas for some volatile and higher uptime there on supers, or Heart of Immos Light for just tons of debuff grenades in combination with Offensive Bulwark, are both really good builds for a strike where you're, again, like Court was talking about a minute ago, you have lots of groups of enemies funneling through areas, same way that Dustfuel Grenade can be super good, same reason this Vortex Grenade is also so good. Impetus, what is going on with the Warlocks?
Well, Warlocks, we've got a really good Void kit, so that's what I'm going to recommend this time around. I'll start off with our super here. We're going to want Vortex, not Cataclysm. We're going to be in some pretty small spaces, some pretty confined spaces for most of this GM. You do not want your super to have a lot of travel time. You also don't want your super to be blocking shots from your teammates or yourself, so Cataclysm is ruled out. Nova Warp, we're not taking that chance. Vortex is safe. It's important to use this specifically on our priority targets like champions after they've been stunned. Wyverns and bosses. We typically, for the Wyverns and the champions, want to throw it at their feet to trap them and keep that damage, keep the super dealing damage over time. That's going to be a big part of Vortex. So that's our super that I'm going to recommend. For the Rift, we've actually got some options here because I'm going to recommend a few different exotics. So if you are running Controverse Holds, which is the exotic armor that I will recommend for people of all skill levels, especially for our beginners, Healing Rift is definitely the option. If you're looking for something to make GM farming, if you plan to do this GM over and over again, looking to make that a little bit easier, Secant Filaments is going to be what I really recommend for our Warlocks here, especially Warlocks on the Void subclass. So in that case, we're going to want to run Empowering Rift, as that is the whole point of Secant Filaments. If you need a refresher on what that does, Secant Filaments allows you to devour when you cast an Empowering Rift. Any damage dealt by you or your allies while you are standing in that Empowering Rift will disrupt combatants. And remember, disruption is overload. So that applies to all of your weapons. They will all get the overload capability as long as they do not have another champion modifier already applied to them. So this gives us a lot of freedom in our heavy weapon options. Remember, I said Witherhoard and Anarchy would be great. This is why Witherhoard and Anarchy will be great. You can make those weapons into overload weapons if you are standing in an Empowering Rift with Secant Filaments. So it's a really strong option, but I wouldn't recommend that for people who are going into Glassway for their very first time. This is more for players who are a little bit more experienced, who are looking to go for some faster times, some faster completions within the Glassway. It's a really consistent stun when you get it, and it can make some stronger weapons really, really good against champions. If you are running Secant Filaments, please make sure to run an Overload Bow just as a backup for when you do not have your Rift up, just for the sake of your fire team members. Don't want to put too much pressure, and you don't want to get caught without an option when all of the Overload champions spawn in the boss room. As for our grenade, I'm going to recommend Vortex no matter what you are running, whether it's Controverse or Secant. You need it for Controverse, but it's always been, in my opinion, the strongest Void option for Warlocks. We've only got the one melee Pocket Singularity. For the aspects, Chaos Accelerant is definitely going to be my top pick. It's going to make the Vortex Grenade even stronger, especially with Controverse. That does stack. It's going to be an excellent option. If you are running Controverse, I think the second aspect should be Feed the Void for extra Devour. That is going to be fantastic. Or, sorry, as a way to get Devour, that is going to be a fantastic option. If you are running Secant Filaments, you could spec into Child of the Old Gods, maybe take off Chaos Accelerant and do Feed the Void and Child of the Old Gods. Child of the Old Gods procs off of casting a Rift, so you might as well get extra benefits since you will be doing that a lot with Secant Filaments. Get that Void Soul created, and then you can go and weaken enemies, so that will be very, very strong. And then, of course, while the target is being drained, you are getting health back if you are running that Empowering Rift. So very, very strong. If you do happen to defeat a target that is being drained by your Void Soul, you will get class ability energy back, so that just feeds into that whole loop with Secant Filaments. So definitely consider that. So it would be for Controverse Hold, your two aspects should be Chaos Accelerant and Feed the Void, and then if you do want to do Secant Filaments, it should be Feed the Void and Child of the Old Gods will be my recommendations there. For our fragments, the 3 echoes that I have for Chaos Accelerant and Feed the Void are going to be Remnants, Undermining, and Persistence. If you are running Feed the Void and Child of the Old Gods, you would have 4 aspects. I still think those 3 are going to be my top. For your additional one, I think this kind of is up to you for what you want. I would probably lean towards, this would probably depend on your fire team composition. If you're able to, if someone else on the fire team is generating a lot of orbs of power, for example, you could run Echo Starvation for extra Devour. That will hit your recovery with a -10. You may not want that on top of the Echo Persistence -10 to your recovery. If you are, for example, trying to go in for some finishers, which we do recommend, you would probably need to be running Aeon Souls, though, for that to really matter. You could go Echo of Obscurity. That's also an option there, so you at least get invisibility when you do that. Defeating the weakened targets with precision final blows to get an orb of power, that's Echo of Harvest. That's also an option for you. That does hurt your intellect. That may be an issue for you. It may not be. Again, there are some different ones. I think that 4th aspect is really up to you. The few that I've just mentioned, I think, are probably the ones that I would lean towards. But again, that's really only, you'll need to consider that if you're running Seek and Filaments and you do have that extra fragment slot unlocked. For the mods, really we've just spec'd into grenade regeneration as much as possible. Devour does help with that, of course, but we want to just make sure we have as many grenades as possible, as they are going to be very strong for crowd control and then just dealing damage over time. So Elemental Ordnance, Seeking Wells is going to be very helpful. Having your wells come to you when you're locked to that Empowering Rift for the overload damage, very useful, especially in the boss room. Even if you're not running Seek and Filaments, you're going to be doing a lot of repositioning as enemies come into that final room. You're going to be running around just keeping track of where everything is. It's always helpful to have the wells come to you while you're making a run around. So. And then finally, Bountiful Wells, again, just making sure that we can get as many wells from grenade kills as possible is going to be the gameplay loop there. So Warlocks, we have a lot of support options. Definitely communicate with your team, see what you're trying to go for. If you're just going for that one clear to check it off for your Conqueror title, I'm probably going to push it towards Controverse Holds. If you are looking to farm this for an Adept DFA, Seek and Filaments is probably going to be the option there. Lean into some really strong damage over time options with Anarchy and Witherhoard with that, and I think you're going to be really good to go. So those are our subclass recommendations. We're now going to get into the actual activity breakdown. Again, it's not going to be an end-all be-all breakdown. We've already talked about this GM before, so we're really just going to be hitting the pain points here. We've got 3 big pain points that we'll talk about. I am going to start us off with what I'd like to call the first 3 rooms that you're going to go through here at the start. You'll have a boss enemy in there, and then you will have 2 champions. It'll be an overload, and then a barrier servitor will spawn in once you advance far enough into the room. So what we want to do when we first come into these 3 rooms, deal with the overload first. Stay far back so you don't spawn in the barrier servitor. After the overload dies, we then want to focus on the boss. You can kill the adds on a need-to basis for spawning elemental wells or orbs of power. Again, this is where grenades are going to be really helpful here. The barrier champion should be saved for last so that you can finish if you are running Aeon Gauntlets. If you are not running Aeon Gauntlets, you can kill it a little bit quicker, but I still think in the terms of order of operations, it should be overload champion, boss, and then barrier. If the barrier does spawn in and it will start making enemies immune, then you need to prioritize the barrier. But if you know where your spaces are, you're staying back with your fire team, the barrier should be the last thing that you need to worry about. After we get through the 3 rooms, again, they're going to change in a little bit of spaces. The first one's going to be quite confined, but they'll gradually open up. The final room will be a bit of a longer one. You'll have a lot of space here. Do be aware of snipers. Sniper resistance is going to be a mod that we definitely want to recommend here in your chess piece. That is going to be a big deal. We're going to have a lot of sniping enemies, so just play those distances, be safe, put down rifts, put down barricades when you need to get some extra cover, and pick away at those enemies as you can. After the 3 rooms, we're going to move further on down into the big hallway that is going to have the giant Radiolera pool that you will need to drain. We're going to start off with what to do while you are draining it. That will require you to stand on a plate to drain the Radiolera. While you are draining the plate, you will have enemies that spawn in from the left and the right side periodically. The biggest thing here is that when the enemies do spawn in, you step off the plate so you do not keep spawning enemies. When you step off the plate, the draining stops, the enemy spawns will stop, so that gives you time to deal with the shanks and the snipers that do show up. The rotation of the enemies here is set, so it will be left, right, and then you will have 2 waves that spawn on both sides. So again, once the enemies appear over the wall, we step off the plate, kill everything, then we activate the plate again. You do not want to overwhelm yourself or your team, as you do not have a lot of space to hide. You're going to be in a very small area. You'll have some crates behind you, but again, it's not a lot, and these enemies are either very up close or they're very far away in terms of the damage they like to deal. You will have exploding shanks appear in the final 2 waves, which will be from both sides, so you want to make sure that you have, ideally, 1 fire team member to cover the left exploding shanks, and then 1 to cover the right exploding shanks. The 3rd fire team member can deal with the resilient shanks that like to snipe. They'll typically set up kind of in the middle there, on the middle side, aiming down at you. Or if that 3rd one is, say, your Titan, have them pop a banner shield, and then the 2 others can focus on both sides and the middle simultaneously. Any sniper damage that is dealt to the banner will spawn orbs of power. So that is a great way to get supers up before you head into the boss room if you need to. After that, you want to make sure that all of the shanks and the sniper vandals are dead before you actually drop down into the hallway itself. You will have enemies spawning down there. Again, we don't want to overwhelm ourselves. We've got a lot of enemies coming in. You want to make sure that you give yourself as fair a chance as possible. You'll have an overload champion in the first half of the hallway, and then as you keep making your way through the various platforms, a barrier servitor will be in the second half. So you can finish both, depending on your ammo situation. We're about to head into the boss room, so just check with your fire team, see if you need to do some finishers. Make sure you kill all the ads before we go with the champion. Again, with a barrier servitor, that could be a little difficult, as the barrier servitor likes to make enemies immune, but if you're able to get, say, an invis hunter in there quickly for that finish when it's ready, definitely go for it, and then make sure that you can cover them as they get away from all the enemies as they come out of invis. Just watch out for sniper vandals. Those will still be spawning up on the walls. They will eventually drop down as you keep moving forward, so deal with them either while they're up on the wall if you have an angle, or you can wait for them to drop down. It's your call, but call them out. Make sure that you're always calling out where the vandals are for your fire team so that they're not caught out in the middle and lead to an unsafe res. So go slow, call out enemies, be methodical. After that, you're going to work your way up a little ramp, and you will be in the boss room.
Yeah, so this is the meat and potatoes section of this strike. There's a lot going on. We have broke this down previously back in episode 11. If you want to go for the bigger picture, the bigger chunkier breakdown, but we will just do a quick highlight of what's going on here. Again, as soon as you enter the boss room, you want to finish that champion for any heavy ammo. If any of your fire team members are using Aeons, and then immediately, because finishing that champion is what causes the boss to spawn. As soon as you finish that champion, book it to the left side of the room. You will spend a lot of your time hiding from the boss or other enemies, and drawing enemies into this area, and this is the best out of the two. Left side, I think, is the best because it's not as well. For one, you don't have a radial area river going through half of the section, which the right side does, but the left side, it's just nice and clean. You've got 3 entrances that you can be sentinels of and just call out whenever anything's coming through those entrances. So for the first phase, both bosses and 2 waves of overload minotaurs will spawn. You want to bait those champions into the room, stun both, and focus damage on one. It is important to have one guardian on stun duty while the other 2 deal damage. As we've already said, Divinity and Le Monarch are going to be your most consistent stunning weapons. They will be your best friends when it comes to stunning overload champions here. Secret Filaments, as Impetus was saying there, can serve as a backup. Witherhoard with that combo is another fantastic choice, or if you're using Anarchy as well. You can deal with the ads by just throwing grenades, Anarchy, Witherhoard near the doorways. The mini Hydra will push into the room at some point during this phase, and this is where we just want to highlight how things are being triggered. So the ads are spawning based on the health of the mini Hydra. And so the mini Hydra's got 3 segmented health bars. Each half of those health bars, so every 6th, is where ads will trigger, where they will spawn. So if you're not ready to bring in any ads, then it's in your best interest not to damage the mini Hydra. It's one of the reasons why I've been recommending stasis in a scenario like this. It's not for the champions, it's for mini Hydra and the wyverns. You can freeze that mini Hydra because it is just a mini boss, and just put him somewhere and keep him stunned, or not stunned, but frozen in a place until you're ready to bring in the next phase of ads. So once you are ready to deal that, deal half of its first third of the health, and then you just want to regroup for the second duo of Overload Minotaurs. Repeat this process with 1 Guardian stunning and 2 Guardians damaging champs. Put down your Anarchies, put down your Wither Hordes, your grenades as well. Finish for ammo if necessary. Burst down the second half of the mini Hydra's first third of the health, which is where the Hydra will disappear, and it'll just be the boss where you'll need to damage his health down to the first third of his health to reach the next phase. So the second phase is where the mini Hydra and 2 waves of 2 wyverns and 2 barrier champions spawn. The wyverns are the top priority here, as Impetus was telling you there about when it comes to his builds. You are prioritizing damaging those type of enemies first before the barrier hobgoblins. I don't think I've ever seen the barrier hobgoblins actually enter that room. They normally stay outside and just chill out. But the wyverns, well, they will push in very aggressively. So again, Wither Horde, Anarchy, Deathbringer, Stasis Freeze again is another top pick here, just to really slow them down, pinpoint them into one position, and then just let all the damage unleash from all 3 of your fireteam members. The barrier hobgoblins can, of course, be used and be finished for ammo, and after the champs die, it will just be the mini Hydra that will be around, so take this time to check for ammo and reload your weapons. Once you're ready, burst down the first half of the mini Hydra's second third to spawn the second wave of wyverns and champs. And again, it's the exact same process. Hopefully you're seeing a pattern here. It's very methodical. You can see when the trigger point is. You don't want to reach that trigger point just yet. Just ease it off and focus on those high priority ads. So once you're done that, again, wyverns, all that stuff, guardians, if you want to, or what I should say is, once you're ready to do that, bring down the mini Hydra's health again, and then repeat the process for wyverns and hobgoblins, and you'll eventually get to the third phase, which is the exact same as the first phase. There's no mini Hydra this time, so you'll just be based on the boss itself and 2 overload minotaurs. Again, you're just baiting those champions into the room and dealing with them one by one. Once you've reached that stage, bring down the boss's health, which will start the fourth phase, which again, it's the second phase. This is where the mini Hydra and the boss spawn, and a second set of wyverns and a second set of champions. You want to kill the mini Hydra. Ideally, focus on the wyverns first, then kill the mini Hydra, and then you'll just have the boss to deal with at the last section of this boss fight. A lot of things going on here. Again, we did do a bigger, substantial breakdown of this boss fight way back in episode 11. It is a tricky one, but once you start seeing the patterns, once you start seeing how things are triggering, you can just get a sense of when things are going to push in. And, you know, the overloads and the wyverns can be a pain, but if you're using, as we've been talking about this episode, with whether it's been Izanagi's or Wither Horde or Secant Filaments with various overload weapons, Deathbringer, you know, all those weapons are great utility against those combatants. And of course, Stasis Freeze can be very useful just to really focus down all these combatants that spawn in. So what time are we kind of expecting to complete this? Really, if you're brand new, you maybe encroaching the sort of hour mark here. If you're brand new to the Glassway, if you've been doing this a few times, you're still kind of trying to figure things out. We can kind of expect 30 to 35 minutes. And of course, the most taxing arena or the encounter for this particular strike is the boss room. The rest of the strike sets up this very weird expectation that, oh yeah, this is going to be pretty easy, but it's not. It's at least when it first released, this was a very tricky Grandmaster strike. It's not so much now. It's kind of leveled down in the ranks of the most frustrating or difficult strike, but it's still up there. It's an interesting challenge. And it's, I think for me anyway, with the type of like how you approach it being very methodical, I do like the challenge of this particular strike. Anything else you guys want to talk about just before we hand things off to two weapons that we want to talk about?
Yeah, it's really easy until it isn't all of a sudden in the boss room. It's like to your point, you just kind of churn through it until you get smacked with a bunch of wyverns and overload champs and everything spawning in all at once. But yeah, just a lot of ground to cover. It's a slog for sure, especially if this is your first time through it.
Yeah,
all right.
I got nothing else to add, so have fun.
Sweet. All right. Well, to round things off with this particular episode, we are going to talk about the weapons that were introduced into this season. We have the Malicious, Birthright, and Mindbenders Ambition. Just a little quick reminder of the two origin traits that you'll get with these weapons. You have the strikes, just the core playlist, Vanguard's Vindication. Final blows with this weapon grant a small amount of health. Technically, that is 7 HP on each kill, and it works everywhere. Secondarily, you've got the Nightfall's Stunning Recovery origin trait, and that reads: stunning a champion partially refills your magazine, triggers health regen, and improves recovery for a short duration. Technically, that means it heals 60 HP, it grants 40 recovery for 3 seconds, and it refreshes a portion of your mag. It works wherever champions are, which obviously you'll see a lot in these Grandmasters. And just as a quick note for the stun effect, when you have a weapon equipped, so let's for example use two weapons that don't have champion mods this season, that's Mindbenders and Militias. If you have those weapons equipped, it will... So when you apply the external overloads or unstoppable or barrier effect, its effects will trigger providing you have those weapons in hand. So it doesn't activate while stowed, and the effects don't trigger when other players are stunning champions. You have to be the one that's stunning the champion. But the external stun factors like Overload Grenade, this season we have Arc. You can use that while you have Malicious Birthright or Mindbender's Ambition in hand, and you'll get those bonuses of Recov, Refreshed Mag, and the Heal HP. So that's just a quick reminder of the origin traits. I'm going to hand you over to Impetus, who's going to talk about Malicious Birthright.
Yes, Militia's is returning again, and it is dropping from Nightfall strikes. It is not craftable. It is a kinetic, lightweight frame that is a breach-loaded grenade launcher, 90 RPM, not that matters. Frame bonus is just simply that it is breach-loaded, fire, and then you release to detonate. We've already talked about the two origin traits it gets. When we look at our kinetic lightweight frame grenade launcher options, we've got some pretty stiff competition here. So the two are Ignition Code and Pardon Our Dust. Ignition Code is no longer obtainable, and as it was from Season of the Splicer, and Pardon Our Dust has just been made craftable this season and is currently dropping from Dares of Eternity. When we look at our stat comparisons here, they are all very, very similar, so there isn't a whole lot to differentiate between the two other than traits, whether that's the main traits or the origin traits. So by default, they all come with 100 blast radius. Malicious has 72 velocity, that is 1 less than Partner Dust and the exact same as Ignition Code. It has 69 handling, which is 1 more than Partner Dust and 5 more than Ignition Code. And it has 63 reload, which is 6 less than Partner Dust and 1 less than Ignition Code. So really not a whole lot here. This does have an adept version, of course, so one more thing to differentiate it, but really it's when we look at these options, we're looking at what perks they roll with to see what's the best option for us. So let's get on to our perks here. For breach loaded grenade launchers, we are big fans of quick launch for that plus 10 velocity and that plus 15 handling. Really, really solid option here. Those are really the two most important stats on breach-loaded grenade launchers. Reload speed can matter, but again, we have perks that can help out with that in columns 3 and 4. So velocity and handling, getting a boost to that from our column 1 perk is always going to be a plus. Moving on to column 2, those are going to be our grenade types that are in the magazine slot. This will change our blast radius stat here. So notably, the big two that we look at are going to be blinding grenades, which will set the blast radius all the way down to 0, and spike grenades, which is going to really let us lean into that 100 blast radius that comes default. So blinding grenades, very useful in in-game PvE for blinding enemies, giving yourself that breathing room to let you reposition before you re-engage with any number of enemies. Spike grenades, of course, very useful for dealing damage. And when we look at the perks that let us do damage or let us blind quicker, we have some pretty interesting ones here. So Ignition Code did make a lot of headway all the way back in Season of the Splicer as it rolled with Slide Shot in Column 3, which did allow for some spam to happen in PvE, which is always fun. We do have Slide Ways on Militia's Birthright. That is a different perk, not the same. So you do get a boost to handling and stability with Slide Ways. That will last for 3 seconds, and it does give you exactly 20 stability and 20 handling. So that should take you with Quick Launch as your barrel option all the way up to 100 for both of those stats, so that can be very helpful. Other big ones that we're seeing in Column 3, we do have Ambitious Assassin, we have Quick Draw, and we have Lead from Gold. Very useful. Ambitious Assassin would probably be really good with spike grenades. Quick Draw, I think I would probably like that with blinding grenades for just a faster when I'm whipping this out to quickly stop an enemy from advancing on me, which is what I typically use blinding for a lot. Lead from Gold also being very useful for spike grenades as well, especially if you are running with a teammate who has Aeons on. That will grant you a lot of special ammo. Looking at column 4, again, it's kind of a weird one. We've got Autoloading Holster showing up in column 4. That's uncommon. We have Frenzy, One for All, and Swashbuckler here. So good options, good damage perks as well. When we're talking about some pairings here, for me, when I think of a blinding grenade build for this weapon in particular, I'm looking at Quick Draw and Autoloading Holster. You could, if you really wanted to, swap out Quick Draw for Lead from Gold and just have 2 reload perks. Again, especially Lead from Gold, useful if you're running with Aeons. If a teammate that you're running with has Aeons on, that will always get you ammo, which means more opportunities for blinding. Definitely a solid option there. If you want to run spike grenades, I think Slideways One for All could be very strong. Good spam, allow you to proc that One for All very quickly. You could also do something like Ambitious Assassin and Frenzy for more grenade shots without having to reload. Very, very helpful there. So a lot of different options, but again, we do have Partner Dust, we do have Ignition Code. I'd say if you already have pretty decent rolls of those, if you've got a crafted version of Partner Dust that you really love, especially if it's a blinding roll, maybe not a whole lot of reason to go grab Malicious Birthright. It comes up to you. If you did miss out on Season of the Splicer, you don't have Dares of Eternity, but you do have access to Militias, go for it. Blinding Grenade Launcher, especially one in the kinetic slot, really does free up your loadout and is a very, very strong tool in in-game PvE. So that is my recommendations for Malicious Birthright. I will pass you off to Saint to talk about an infamous shotgun.
Yeah, next up, we are also talking about kind of a weird weapon here. This is Mindbenders Ambition. This was very notorious for its time in the spotlight in the Crucible meta. This was kind of when quick draw and aggressives were really gaining hugely in popularity. But that's been years ago. And now Mindbenders is back, and it's not the same. It's very different. So this is a solar aggressive frame shotgun, 55 RPM, that hard-hitting high recoil and increased rate of fire after you get a defeat. This is the only solar aggressive frame shotgun non-sunset weapon. So it's a bit strange in that it is kind of on its own. It has, Found Verdict and Sudden Death are arc versions of this weapon, so that's kind of its closest competitors, even though those occupy very different spaces. And kind of looking at how they compare, it's pretty clear where they land. This Mindbenders has 29 range versus 31 on Found Verdict or 24 on Sudden Death. It's got 31 handling versus 39 on Found Verdict and 24 on Sudden Death. And then 39 reload versus 36 on Found Verdict or 32 on Sudden Death. It's kind of one interesting thing here is it has 5 rounds in the base mag, or 5 shells, if you'd like to say, in the base mag versus 4 versus typical kind of aggressive shotgun. So a bit interesting. It's Found Verdict is just statistically the superior shotgun. It's hugely popular in the Crucible right now because of its base stats and things like that for an aggressive, and it definitely does beat out its other just general competitor for aggressive range shotguns. Which would be Sudden Death. So a bit strange, not a ton of competition, and not great base stats, but not terrible overall for its archetype. Whenever we look at some barrels and mags, you've got Corkscrew, just nice +5 across the board there, especially the handling is going to be really nice for that. Small bore for a +7 to stability and range, and then full choke if you want to go spoilers for a 1-2 punch build. Mag, assault mag for that extra RPM, or tac mag for an extra shell and a +10 to reload. It kind of depends on what you want to be using this for. Both are good options if you can pick up either, honestly. When we look at the main traits, it is definitely a bit of a shift away from its once Crucible dominance and has a much more of a PvE focus these days. In Column 3, we have Slideways, Threat Detector, Lead from Gold, and Auto-Loading Holster. So a lot of, just your kind of reload and ammo-based perks there. And then a few different options in Column 4 with Swashbuckler, 1-2 Punch, and Incandescent, which is an interesting perk. Also present on the Seasonal Shotgun from Season of the Haunted that we just went through, I believe. So, interesting. Nothing crazy. Nothing really jump out here. Probably going major spec for Hamad, and then masterwork, just maybe a handling, a reload, kind of depending on where I'm going for here. On my main focus build that I would, slot this in for my Titan is your very melee focus build. Slideways 1-2 punch if I am going to be using a shield bash or something like that. Because of the way that those melee abilities work, sliding before you go in will allow you to get the shot off and then go into like a shield bash, so to say. So slide shot, Slideways, and 1-2 punch is kind of a very classic combo if you are somebody that is looking for a melee heavy type of build or a punchy build. Also, I guess if you're a hunter and you're going for a arc very heavy punching build, this one's not quite as important for you. And then for more melee, we have Pugilist and Swashbuckler. If I was going to jump into something like Consecration, right, from my Solar Titan, this probably fit really nice into that build, more of a melee and then get some kills build, something like that would go really nice with Assault Mag, just for that extra RPM against some measures. And then just kind of the fun, you got Threat Detector and Incandescent. If you just want to have some fun with it, it's not necessarily going to be a meta pick with Incandescent, but it is going to be a fun one. So I maybe would put this into a kind of Solar Titan heavy melee build or a Void Titan melee heavy build. Core Impetus, what are you guys feeling about these Nightfall weapons here for a little, just kind of where are they going to fit into our loadouts and meta, or if they are at all?
I think Quartz Face sums it up perfectly right there. I don't know about that one, Chief.
Yeah, we were talking about this before we started recording the episode, and it's something not quite right with the Nightfall weapons. Last season we had Horror's Least and the other one. Silicon.
Gosh, now you got me. No, that was.
Was it?
What Was it? That must have been terrible. I'm looking
No,
at my inventory right now.
No, it wasn't. No, DFA. Was it DFA?
Oh, gosh. Oh, it was DFA.
Yeah, I think so. That was new last season.
See, even that is indicative of how much we're kind of quite uninterested by these Nightfall weapons since the Hothead left. I think maybe other than Horror's Least, which I do want to get a nice roll of, there's nothing else that I'm interested in.
Yeah, I mean, Saint said it perfectly. Mindbenders would actually be really interesting if I hadn't already crafted a Without Remorse last season that I got leveled up and have, enhanced perks on that I can spec into as a Solar Titan or a Solar Hunter. It's like, okay, you just gave it the exact same perk pool, but it's a different archetype of shotgun.
Yeah. And I mean, I look at the 1-2 punch build and I'm like, oh, that would be cool if I didn't have my Wastelander with enhanced 1-2 punch slide shot already on it. And it's the same thing with Pardon Our Dust. Why would I seek out a Malicious Birthright? I mean, stunning recovery on a grenade launcher, it's cool, but unless I'm in Seeking Filaments or something like that, it doesn't really deliver much additional value,
Yeah, and the Adept version really just doesn't factor into the equation as much anymore.
I think Nightfall weapons sort of tap into the same problem energy that we have with Adept raid weapons, where is there anything that's making them more appealing or interesting compared to the craftable versions? The answer is no. So I know Bungie have mentioned that they want to look at this again and see what they could do to Adept weapons and just kind of really make them stand out in their own ways. And I hope they can really knock it out the park. But at the moment, these all 6 weapons, other than Horror's Least, I think for me, I am just not really interested in. Again, we lost a Hothead, which was its own thing. And was a great rocket launcher for multiple reasons, because it's an adaptive frame which does one of the highest damage. It's got some great perks like Explosive Light, but some of these perks here with the shotgun and the grenade launcher, it's just you already kind of see all this on weapons that you've already crafted. So yeah, I've got nothing else much to say about Nightfall weapons.
Yeah, I see. I'm looking at our kind of our season of GMs here. I think that Horror's Least will be super strong, like Lightblade and Disgraced, where you've got Arc Unstop, right? Okay, well now, that's an environment where I can really capitalize on my stunning recovery, and make, it actually makes its, traits useful, in that case. But yeah, agreed, it's just not enough of a value proposition at the moment to drive us towards this. And it is a little disappointing whenever we consider the kind of mindset of a perk refresh weapon that's brought back into the game. And I think I guess the last thing I'll say about this is there is a world in which you don't have access to Pardon Our Dust, and the Malicious Birthright with auto-loading holster quick draw is the best blinding GL that you can access. And I get that, but unless you're in the situation where you don't have access to one of the other weapons, just because you weren't playing the game at that time, or you don't have that content and you don't want to spend the money on it, that's probably the only situation in which this is going to be the best in slot, so to say, for either of these weapons. Yeah,
I'd agree with that. The perk pools are getting more specific, but it's not always been a good thing, as we're starting to find out. There's very specific builds that can be really strong in the right circumstances, but sometimes we just don't come across those situations enough to justify doing a Grandmaster for them. So, all right, well, unless you guys have anything else to say, I think that concludes our breakdown of the first of Season 19's Grandmaster Nightfalls. Thank you so much for listening to episode 34 of Podcast vs. Enemies, and thank you to our audio engineer, MisterSudden, for his valiant fight against G-Hub and my incompetence. Speaking of me, my name is Impetus, and you can find me by that name on Discord and in Destiny, and as Impetus always on Twitter and Twitch. Court, where can we find you?
Yes, you can find me over on Twitter as @CourtProjects, on Discord as Court, and you can find my documentation and spreadsheets over on the Massive Breakdowns website, where you'll also see a lot of applications and documentation from the community members across the Massive Breakdowns network. Saint, where can we find you?
Yep, my name is Saint Kabir. You can find me by Saint_Kabir on Discord, Twitter, and lurking around in those Twitch chats. Thank you for listening in to another episode of PvE.